Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. The Michigan defensive coordinator search continues on, but a new candidate has emerged for Sherrone Moore and this program, and that's Wink Martindale, one of the more respected defensive coordinators from the NFL ranks. Obviously, spent a lot of time with the Baltimore Ravens. And Dill, you were the one who sent me this tweet, and I thought, what is there a better option to replace guys like Mike Macdonald and Jesse Minter than the defensive coordinator that both of those worked under during their time at the Baltimore Ravens? Wink Martindale, I think, would be a phenomenal hire. I want to talk about a couple different things. One, what Wink Martindale brings to this Michigan defense, and then what is this Michigan staff going to look like and kind of play out over the next couple of weeks. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. And many of you guys know we are massive Michigan fans. It's been a wild last couple of weeks breaking down the coaching candidates and kind of the coaching carousel, if you will, for this Michigan program. And the amount of feedback, the amount of input you guys have given, it's been absolutely a blast. We're having some great conversation in the comment section. Cannot thank you guys enough for all the support you guys have shown. If y'all do enjoy the content, enjoy the updates, consider subscribing to the channel. But more importantly, let us know in the comment section how you guys are feeling about the potential of Wink Martindale taking over this Michigan defense heading into 2024. Dill, you were the one who was fired up in the first place for the potential Wink Martindale hire. How are we feeling about Wink Martindale maybe being the next defensive coordinator in Ann Arbor?
And we kind of talked about it. Like, he had two options: kind of go with the NFL kind of model, keep it in the NFL tree, if you will, or go to that college rank, get more of a recruiter, a guy who's grown up through the college rank, and that's where they're more familiar, like a Jim Leonard. Obviously, it seems like Sherrone Moore is going to go the NFL route. And frankly, for him, as a first-year head coach and kind of listening to some of his interviews, he's like, you do get hit with a lot. You got to deal with a lot of new things, obviously, in a very changing landscape in college football. I think it's not the worst thing in the world to have a coordinator on the defensive side of the ball where you can just turn the keys over to and let him rock and roll. And now I do think along this, you probably would like to see some young, hungry recruiters for these position coaches to fill in. And I know we'll get to that later. But just as like kind of Sherrone Moore brings his era in, I do like the idea of bringing in a coordinator who I think can run this with no hiccup, pick up where everyone left off and be left alone and do a really good job.
Yeah, and I think that's a phenomenal point. And you're seeing a lot of head coaches go to kind of this style, right? I think Hugh Freeze did this with the DJ Durkin hire where it's like, hey, I want to focus on certain aspects of being a head coach, maybe on the offensive side of the football. I want a defensive coordinator that's been around the block. And Wink Martindale has been a defensive coordinator in the NFL for the last 5 years. He's been around the block, managing a defense. He's not going to need to be micromanaged. Sherrone Moore is not going to need to micromanage what Wink is doing on the defensive side of the football. And I think probably the bigger storyline for this is you look at why Michigan has had so much success the last 3 years. It's been with this style of defense, right? Mike Macdonald, Jesse Minter, a lot of the principles that they ran were being run by Wink Martindale when he was the defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens. And I don't know if it's fair to say Wink Martindale was a mentor to both Minter and Macdonald, but they both worked underneath him. They both learned a lot from him. So you talk about continuity, and that's the word that we've been talking about throughout the last couple of weeks. I mean, you talk about it kind of keeping on what's helped Michigan so much the last 3 years at the college level. I think Wink Martindale certainly gives you that continuity for this Michigan defense heading into 2024.
And especially how it was kind of like built where it like Macdonald came in and they were a good defense in 21 for sure. But like you saw the growing pains. You saw it against Michigan State where guys weren't getting lined up, were slow to their spots. You saw it get better in 21. And then you kind of all saw it materialize in that 2020 or 2023 year, I should say, where they were ultimately the best team. I think that's the best defense we've seen maybe since Georgia in 21. And I think Michigan gives that team a run for their money on defense. You saw it build. I think with Wink Martindale, the guys are going to play a similar kind of style. They know how to play it. And again, it just kind of keeps what you're talking about, where I just think you've noticed so much with these defensive coordinator shuffles across the country in college football. It really does matter to keep that continuity, because when you see a Brent Venables come into Oklahoma, it felt very disruptive for the first year, got better in year 2. I'm sure they wanted to get better in year 3, and you've seen that with everyone, it seems like.
And one other thing that I think is so important that doesn't get talked enough about, me not taking away from the slightest of how talented this Michigan defense was the last couple of years, But this style of defense, the stunts that we run up front, the different blitz packages that we have, the different coverage packages that we have, the NFL complexity of this defensive scheme really throws these opposing offenses for a loop. I go back to that Alabama game in the semifinals. That Alabama offensive line, yes, we were winning some one-on-one matchups. They could not handle the different looks, the different stunts, the different pressure packages that Michigan was throwing at them. You look at the jump that Michigan's defense has had year after year. I think it's the more comfortable they are in this complex scheme has meant world to this Michigan.
Martindale's going to come in and be a very aggressive coordinator.
Yes.
And maybe even more so than the last two, frankly. And again, it's different though than like the old Don Brown defense where it was just blitz from your base 4-3 formation and see what happens. It's like you kind of look at what Wink Martindale does. Usually has two defensive linemen with their hand in the ground, and then the blitz are coming from everywhere, and you really don't know. It's just, again, it's not like just blitzing the blitz. It's being strategic about it. It's doing it from varied looks, and that's what, again, I think you kind of look back at the evolution of what Michigan's defense was. It was so very vanilla, and they sometimes got away with it because their players were really good through those years. But at the end of the day, the scheme was very bland, and when they played teams that were on par with them, like Ohio State, they get cooked a little bit. Now you kind of starting to see with this Michigan scheme, it's just confusing guys. They're taking the ball away more. They're making more negative plays, and they're really starting to take it to really good offenses like Washington.
You talk about what Wink Martindale brings to the table. I texted one of my buddies who's a Giants fan. I was like, hey, Wink Martindale, what's he bring to the table? And that was the first thing he said, blitz. Like, this is an aggressive defense. They're bringing a lot of pressure, and they're trying to wreak havoc in the backfield. They're trying to confuse quarterbacks, and you said it best. Like, it's not just those standard blitzes. It's different looks, different blitz packages that we saw offensive lines really struggle to pick up against Michigan in 2023. And you hire Wink Martindale, you probably see much of the same in 2024. There are a couple other notes that I have on Wink Martindale. One, he's from Ohio, has spent a lot of time in that region. You talk about recruiting, you talk about the relationships in that state and what it means to Michigan on the recruiting trail. That's a plus. The second plus, not only is a Super Bowl champion at the Baltimore Ravens, he's a national championship with Western Kentucky. Then you do a little research. Who was the head coach at Western Kentucky? It was Jack Harbaugh, Jim and John's dad. And so you look at the pedigree that he has, and I think this is a perfect segue to talk a little bit about maybe the concerns that you have. There's a lot to be excited about, right? Continuing, kind of going to this Ravens tree, continuing what we've seen. The concerns would be, one, does he have that recruiting knack, right? This is a different landscape than he was at when he was at Western Kentucky. College football has obviously changed a lot. Will he be able to get it done on the recruiting trail? Two things that I have. One, I think you made a really good point. We'll dive into it in terms of surrounding with position coaches that are dogs on the recruiting trail. Number two, when you have a national championship, when you have a Super Bowl ring, I think that is more and more carrying a lot of weight on the recruiting trail. I mean, with the NIL, yes, NIL matters in recruiting, but what do these kids care about the most? They want to win national championships, which Michigan just did, and they want to go to the NFL. When you have that Super Bowl ring on your finger, you know what it's like to be in the NFL. You know what it takes to get to the NFL. And so a guy like Wink Martindale, yes, you have some questions on can he recruit because he hasn't been at the college level in the last 10 years. But with that NFL ring on his finger, I think that holds a lot of weight on the recruiting trail. And I'm kind of interested to see what Wink Martindale could do as a recruiter at the college level.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, just because he hasn't had to recruit doesn't mean he can't. I mean, obviously, coaching's a relationship game kind of thing, and he's been doing it forever and has stuck around places for a very long time. I mean, to be in like an organization like the Ravens for God, however many years it was, I think it was almost 8 years or so. Like, that's a long time. That's like a kind of guy who's been able to stick. Like, that's not easy. You kind of look at what NFL coordinators and position coaches do. They're all jumping around. It feels like year to year to year. He obviously, I mean, he can stick at places. He does a good job building his relationships there for sure. And then at the end of the day, to me, it's not about necessarily him recruiting. Like, he might need to close deals or something, if you will, on the trail or be the final guy someone talks to on the defensive side. But at the end of the day, they need hungrier, younger position coaches.
I think you're going to see Sherrone Moore go to that. You know, like you look at Sherrone Moore and some of the differences you're going to see within this program from the Jim Harbaugh days. There's going to probably be a little bit more emphasis on recruiting. Sherrone Moore was the ace for us on the recruiting trail during his assistant coaching days. And I think he's going to bring that emphasis as a head coach. And I think as he continues to fill out this staff, I think a lot of emphasis and thought is going to be regarding how well can you get those relationships going on the recruiting trail. You look to the offensive side of the football. You obviously look at a guy like Newsome has been really good on the recruiting trail at that tight end position, now elevated to the offensive line. You look at a guy like Kirk Campbell, was phenomenal recruiting the quarterback spot in his short time at Michigan as well. You look at the defensive side of the football, you get an experienced defensive coordinator that you can trust running this defense and the continuity of this defense. And then you look at who he might hire around the defensive coordinator. I bet you're going to see an emphasis on young coaches that want to recruit. And that is something that we've talked about a lot. I think it's taken for granted. Like in this era, you're seeing a lot of coaches go to the NFL because they don't want to recruit. You got to get those young coaches that want to be active on the trail, get those relationships going. And I think Sherrone Moore, as a young head coach himself, is going to put a strong emphasis on surrounding a guy like Wink, if he becomes the next DC, with a lot of young coaches that can get it done on the trail.
And you look at what Kirby Smart's built at Georgia. I mean, essentially, he's the defensive coordinator at the end of the day, probably. And he's just put a bunch of young, hungry coaches around him, Fran Brown, Glenn Schumann, Dan Lanning, and they just were able to rock it on the trail. And you kind of look at what Michigan was at times. Yes, Clinkscale can recruit for sure. Yes, Sherrone Moore could recruit. But at the end of the day, you didn't have like those hammers on the recruiting trail across the board. That's the one thing I think you're looking for. If you bring in Wink Martindale, I think he needs to get like monsters on the trail, guys who are going to be really aggressive, really active, and do it a little different than what Michigan's done. Because again, I like what Michigan, obviously you can't complain about the results, but it will, I mean, the question will always be out there. How sustainable is it to recruit the way they recruit and win at the level they're winning? And I'm not saying you can't do it, but I do think I'd like to see Sherrone Moore and the whole staff crank it up.
And I think one other, and this will wrap it up on this, one other potential con, I don't even think I considered a con, is how long would Wink stay at Michigan? My take on it, we talked about it a little yesterday afternoon. When you're hiring coordinators, if your coordinators aren't getting outside job interest looking to move up, you're probably hiring the wrong coordinators, right? You look at Nick Saban and what made that program so special for so long is when he'd hire a coordinator, within 2 years, they're getting promoted. They're getting a head coaching job. They're getting an NFL job. What does that say? Nick Saban's making the right hires. And so as much as you want to get at Mike McDonald and Jesse Minter, those hires, because they didn't stay, you hired them. They were phenomenal at what they did, and they go to the next level. So you grab a guy like Wink. He has a phenomenal 2 to 3 years at Michigan. Maybe he gets another NFL DC job. Maybe even gets an NFL head coaching job. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But at the end of the day, when you have your assistants consistently moving up, it becomes a very attractive spot for the next hire. Right? Why was Nick Saban be able to surround himself with such amazing coaches for the last 15 years during his time in Tuscaloosa? Because every time he made a hire, the guys would move up the food chain a little bit. And I think you're seeing that happen at Michigan. I think that is a really good thing. So the question mark about how long Wink will be there, I don't know if it matters that much, because if he does a good job and gets an NFL job, that's okay. That means you made the right hire in my mind. We'll be interested to see how this plays out. Again, the option of Clink is still on the table, no doubt, but it does sound like Sherrone Moore going to the NFL ranks to get our next DC. Again, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section on the next DC, what you think about Wink. We'll chop it up there. Appreciate all the support you guys have shown. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.